That means you're live.
Correct.
Down there? Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Father Thomas Bama, the Provost of the University of St. Mary the Lake, and I have the honor of acting as Master of Ceremonies for this year's Albert Cardinal Meyer Lecture Series. Let me begin by telling you a couple of things about this wonderful building if you're a guest here today. The Cardinal Mundelein Auditorium was the last of the original buildings to be built on campus. Completed in 1939, it was built as a place for major lectures, musical performances, and theatrical plays. It was Cardinal Mundelein's notion that formation extended beyond the formal curriculum. So he established a number of extracurricular lectures to foster the idea of thinking deeply about critical subjects. That tradition continued under Monsignor Hillenbrand, the second rector, who introduced the seminarians to the great tradition of the papal social encyclicals, to the young liturgical movement, and to specialized Catholic action. It's fair to say that these two men left an indelible mark on the Chicago Presbyterate and on this seminary. This great auditorium, then, is a place for reaching our minds beyond the classroom toward the critical issues facing the church and society. The lecture series begins tonight and will continue tomorrow from 9 in the morning until noon. Archdeacon John will deliver his first lecture tonight, after which there'll be some discussion, and then the second tomorrow morning. Faculty responses by Father Robert Schoenstein and Father Ronald Kunkel will follow at 10:30, and the program will conclude by noon. These business matters complete, it's my honor to introduce the Very Reverend John Carchi, the Rector and President of the University of St. Mary of the Lake.
Good evening. On behalf of all the faculty here at the University of St. Mary of the Lake, which is, of course, home to Mundelein Seminary, I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone. The Meyer Lecture Series is, of course, named after Cardinal Meyer, 5th Archbishop of Chicago. He was ordained a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee originally in 1926, graduated from the Pontifical Biblical Institute, and certainly was a significant figure at the Second Vatican Council, always championing a deeper engagement between the Church and the modern world. The Meyer Lecture Series is an endowed lectureship made possible by the generosity of Reverend Andrew M. Greeley, an alumnus of Mundelein from the class of 1954. Father Greeley's original intention was for a strong intellectual engagement of topics and issues after the model of the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh. The Meyer Lectures, while intended to focus on contemporary issues in theology and the Church, would also be interdisciplinary, drawing themes not only from theology, but also from literature, the law, the social sciences, and the arts. Talks are formally published by the University of St. Mary of the Lake, most likely in Chicago Studies, and we hope to release a collection of all the previous year's lectures within the coming years. In addition to our seminarians, I want to welcome our students from the various schools of the university, the Pontifical Faculty, the Liturgical Institute, and the Ministry Formation Institutes. I also want to welcome our alumni and guests, and tonight especially our guests from the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Chicago. Please enjoy the program tonight and tomorrow, and do take advantage of walking around the campus if you have the chance, and just enjoy the natural beauty of the place that we're blessed with. So at this point, I'll turn the microphone back over to our provost, Father Thomas Bema, who will introduce tonight's 2020 Meyer Lecturer.
The Reverend Dr. John Chrysavgis is Archdeacon of the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. He serves as the theological advisor to the Ecumenical Patriarch on environmental issues, and is theologian for the Office of Inter-Orthodox Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations for the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. A noted scholar in his own right, he's the author of several books and numerous articles in numerous languages on the Church Fathers and Orthodox spirituality. Dr. Chrysavgis' most recent publications include Reflections on Abba Zosima and Beyond the Shattered Image, Insights into an Orthodox Christian Ecological Worldview. He's also working on 2 volumes with the full correspondence of Bar Sanufius and John which appeared in the 2006-2007 Fathers of the Church series published by the Catholic University of America. Archdeacon John completed his doctoral studies in patristics at the University of Oxford. He has another distinction. In my role as academic officer here, I've introduced a lot of internationally renowned scholars, but tonight we have a first, because although many of our lecturers have published exceptional books and given wonderful lectures, Archdeacon John is the first one I've introduced who has published a book with a chapter by Pope Benedict XVI and the preface of the book written by Pope Francis. And that's his autobiography, his biography, of Patriarch Bartholomew. Without any further ado, I welcome this year's Albert Cardinal Meyer Lecture, Archdeacon John Chrysovgis.
So I wasn't sure which side to come in, actually, but deacons know you never go behind closed curtains. I am very, very honored to be here with you this evening on this spectacular campus. And I have to admit, what Father Thomas knows, that I'm here by accident almost. I say that because I reached out to Father Thomas because I thought it was important that the largest Catholic seminary in the United States should be in touch with the seminary that we have in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese on the East Coast, and a seminary that's led by archbishops and cardinals, present and past, that have been so ecumenically minded, should also be in touch with the ecumenical patriarchate, especially in an age where the head of the ecumenical patriarchate and the head of the Roman Catholic Church are personal and close friends. So I reached out to him, asking how we might collaborate, and his immediate response was, "So come and give a lecture." I thought, that's not what I was calling about. But I am honored to be here. It's truly a beautiful campus that I'd heard about, that I know that our brothers in the Greek Orthodox metropolis use as a retreat center from time to time. So thank you for having me, Reverend President and Reverend Provost, Your Grace, and dear, dear friends. Let me start by taking you by the hand and leading you back on a journey back to what churches and theologians like to call the beginning. That's often, and rightly so, the preferred starting point for speaking about the environment, at least in Christian circles. But whenever people think of the Genesis story, they focus on our creation by a loving God, and they forget our connection to the environment. It could be a natural reaction, could be a sign of our arrogance maybe, but the truth is that Christians tend to overemphasize our creation in the image and likeness of God and overlook our creation from the dust of the ground. Well, I would claim that our heavenliness should not overshadow our earthliness. Most people are actually unaware that we humans did not get a day to ourselves in the creation story. In fact, we shared that sixth day with all the creeping and crawling things of the world, all the sorts of bugs and insects you would not want in your bed at night. We shared the creation day with them. We don't have to talk about human beings as in exceptionalistic or hubristic terms. Perhaps our uniqueness lies simply in our peculiar relationship to nature. The story of Noah, just as the creation story, they both tell us that saving humanity is inseparable from saving other creatures. And it's helpful to remember that. It's humble to remember that truth. And if we tend to forget, well, in recent years, we've been painfully reminded of this reality with the cruel flora and fauna extinction, with the irresponsible soil and forest clearance, with the unacceptable noise, air and water pollution. And still, our concern for the environment should not be reduced to some superficial or sentimental love. It's a way of honoring our creation by God. It's a way of hearing the groaning of creation. It should be an affirmation of the truth of that sixth day of creation. Anything less than the truth, than the full truth and nothing but the truth, is dangerous heresy. And by the way, speaking of heresy, when assessing the ecological crisis, is not too far-fetched at all. Because whenever we speak of heavenly or earthly things, we're always inevitably drawing on established values that we have of ourselves and our world, the technical language that we adopt, the particular species that we want to preserve. All of these depend on principles that we promote, even presume. You know, we tend to call our predicament an ecological crisis. But the root of the problem lies in the paradigms that impel us to pursue a particular lifestyle. The crisis concerns the way we imagine our world. It's essentially a battle over images and icons. It's how we see the world around us. In classical traditions, human beings regarded themselves as descendant from God or the gods. They looked on the world as soulful, not soulless, as sacred, like them, not subjected to them. In their experience, every flower, every bird, every star was holy. The sap of the trees was their lifeblood. Nature was not for experimentation or exploitation, and trade was never at the expense of nature. So, when I consider the experience, for instance, of the Christian tradition, and in particular my own tradition as an Orthodox Christian, I turn to its distinct symbols and values, which include icons that I would interpret as the way we are supposed to view and perceive creation. And I think of liturgy, which I interpret as the way we're supposed to celebrate and respond and respect creation. And I think of askesis, that we'll talk about a little later, which I interpret as the way we treat creation, the way we behave toward the rest of nature. Early Christian mystics recognized that when our eyes are opened to the beauty of the world, then we can clearly see the divine sparks scattered everywhere. So let's look at these three dimensions separately. The iconic vision, first, of nature. Seeing clearly is exactly what icons teach us to do. The world of the icon reveals the eternal dimension in everything we see, everything we experience. Our generation, it might be said, is characterized by a sense of self-centeredness toward the natural world, by a lack of awareness of the beyond. You know, when Noah saved the animals 2 by 2, he wasn't saving specimens or species, he was saving an ecosystem. And we've broken that covenant between ourselves and God. Now, in Orthodox spirituality, the icon reflects the restoration of that sacred covenant. It reminds us of another world. It speaks in this world the language of the age to come. The icon provides a corrective to our culture that gives value only to the here and now. The icon aspires to the inner vision of everything, to the world as created, as intended by God. And the first image that an iconographer will always attempt is the transfiguration of Christ on Mount Tabor. Precisely because the iconographer strives to hold together this world and the next, because by disconnecting this world from heaven, we actually desacralize both. This is where the teaching about Jesus Christ at the very heart of iconography emerges. In the icon of Jesus Christ, the uncreated God assumes a human face, a beauty, as Dostoevsky wrote, that can save the world. And in Orthodox icons, faces are always frontal. They always depict 2 eyes gazing back at the beholder. The conviction here is that Christ is in our midst. Profile signifies sin, as here with Judas in profile. Profile implies rupture. Whereas faces, communion, is always frontal. All eyes, as the Desert Fathers would say, profoundly receptive, eternally susceptive of divine grace. I see means that I am seen, which means that I am in love. Remember the title of C.S. Lewis's love story, Till We Have Faces. Love compels us to see things differently, to see things from another perspective, to see things from the perspective of another, to see things from the perspective of the future. Ecology is much more than flora and fauna. It's about that social nexus that surrounds them. So the icon converts the beholder from a restricted worldview to a fuller vision. And the light in the icons is the light of reconciliation. It's not the waning light of this world. It's a light, to quote one Orthodox hymn, that knows no evening. And so icons depicting events that occurred in daytime are no brighter than icons depicting events that occurred at nighttime. For example, the icon of the descent from the cross, no darker than the icon of the ascension. The icon of the nativity, no brighter than the icon of the crucifixion. The somber light of the Last Supper mirrors the same light of the supreme feast of light, the Transfiguration, because the icon presupposes, again to quote another Orthodox Easter hymn, a different way of living. In fact, the whole world is seen differently in icons. The whole world is seen as a ladder or an icon. In fact, everything is a sign of God, as the second century mystic said, which is precisely why in icons, rivers assume a human form. So too do the sun and the moon, as if a child is painting them. The stars, the waters, they all have human faces. They all acquire a personal dimension, just like us, just like God. Now, the destruction of our planet's ecosystems and resources can only be restrained if we begin to see nature as an icon. Take any painting. The narcissist will see a wooden frame. If he is cold, he will burn it to keep warm. An altruist will see a sacred canvas. She will admire it, recall the uniqueness of the artist, a Rembrandt or a Van Gogh. Only when our attitude to the painting changes do we value it. So if the world is an icon, it means that nothing lacks sacredness. Put bluntly, if you can't find God in this world, you're not going to find him in heaven either. So let's turn to liturgy now, because what icons achieve in space, in matter, in wood, the liturgy accomplishes in song, in chant. The same ministry of reconciliation between heaven and earth. What the icon achieves in material, liturgy accomplishes in music. The same ministry of reconciliation. If icons are an artistic means for the created world to remain in communication with the uncreated God, then liturgy is the aesthetic medium for our world to reach communion with its creator. It's a way of reconciliation. It's what theologians like to call at-one-ment, atonement. In fact, the Greek word for atonement, for forgiveness, for reconciliation, the word synchorisis, implies not sinfulness and repentance or guilt. And by the way, I don't speak Spanish, but in the Mass today, I got the peccato part and got the culpa part. We're really good at that as Christians. But the word for forgiveness in Greek, synchorisis, literally means, simply means, being in the same space with everyone else. That's what happens during liturgy. That's what happens during Mass. So when I say liturgy or liturgical, I don't just mean ritual. I mean relational. Or again, in the context of icons that we mentioned before, think of the world as a picture. You need every part of an image in order for it to be complete. Removing one part of the picture, a tree, an animal, a human being, distorts the whole picture. If we are guilty of relentless abuse and waste of our planet's resources, it could be because we've lost this spirit of liturgy, of worship. We're no longer respectful pilgrims in the world. We've become tourists. We have to restore this sense of awe and delight in our relationship to the world. The truth is that we respond to nature with the same delicacy, the very same sensitivity and tenderness with which we respond to any human person. You know, through the ecumenical movement or through other social programs, we've learned that we cannot treat people like things. Well, let me propose to you today that we have to begin to learn not to treat even things like mere things. All of our spiritual activities are measured by their impact on the world, on people, especially the poor. And the liturgy is the language that commemorates, that celebrates the innate, that intimate connection between God and people and things, what in the 7th century St. Maximus the Confessor called a cosmic liturgy, and what in the same century Abba Isaac the Syrian described as acquiring a merciful heart, a heart that burns with love for all of creation, for humans, for birds, for the beasts, even for demons, he says, for all of God's creatures. And in the early 20th century, Fyodor Dostoevsky conveyed the same vision in his Brothers Karamazov, when he said, "Love all of God's creation, every grain of sand. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light. If you love everything, you will perceive the divine mystery in all things." There's a dimension of music and of art and of beauty and of song in the world, which also implies, by the way, for us as Christians, for people studying for the priesthood, that whenever we narrow life, religious life, but also political life, social life, whenever we narrow it to ourselves and our own interests, we're neglecting our vocation to reconcile all of God's creation, because our relationship with this world determines our relationship with heaven. The way we treat the earth is reflected in the way we kneel before God. Okay, that's the good news. Of course, unless you live in Maine, this world does not always look or feel like heaven. And in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, or BP's oil disaster a year before that, it was admittedly a little difficult to perceive what Dostoevsky called the divine mystery in all things. So how do we reconcile this mystery with reality? For Christian theology, the answer lies in a tree. As John Chrysostom observed in the 4th century when he was commenting on Paul's letter to the Colossians, God, says Paul, was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, through the blood of his cross. And reference here to the blood of the cross is an indication that there's a cost involved when we fail to recognize the sacredness of creation. The cross reminds us of the reality of human failure and the radical reversal that's required in our perspectives and practices. There's a price to pay for our wasting. The balance of the world has been shattered, and the ecological crisis will not just be solved with smiley stickers. The tree of the cross is what presents the solution as self-discipline, self-denial. That's what I mean by ascesis. The antidote, basically, to self-centeredness. The cross is not just an empty symbol. It's certainly not bling jewelry. It's the expression of brokenness, the confession of failure, which may be the reason why so many are in denial about climate change, claiming it's a hoax or claiming it can be fixed with Band-Aid solutions, because it's hard work to resolve, to reconcile. So in Orthodox spiritual teaching, the cross translates into ascesis. Here is Anthony, the father of monasticism in early Egypt. It's the way of assuming responsibility for one's actions and one's world, because it's really critical to look in the mirror from time to time and to ask, is what I have what I need? Did I travel here on a plane to deliver a talk on the environment? How do I reflect the world's thirst for oil or greed that is destroying the planet? And of course, the earth keeps reminding us of our denial, and yet we still stubbornly refuse to accept that our comfortable lives, dependent on cheap energy, are somehow responsible for the millions of gallons of oil polluting the Gulf of Mexico. How can we logically believe that a century of pumping oil-fired pollution into the atmosphere won't have any ramifications. And ascesis is more than just self-discipline. It's ultimately learning to be free. It's learning to be uncompelled by ways that use or abuse the world. It's learning to be characterized by self-control, by the ability to say no or enough. Why is it that my pet dog, Emily, knew when enough was enough, and I don't? Ascesis aims at not detachment or destruction, but refinement, restoration. Take the example of fasting. We're at the beginning of Great Lent. Learning to fast is learning not just to give up, it's learning to give. It's learning to share. It's all about communion. It's recognizing in other people faces and in the earth the very face of God. And here, I think, lies the heart of the problem. Because we are unwilling. In fact, quite frankly, we violently resist any call to adopt simpler lives. People just don't want that. Everyone in this room is guilty of consuming far more than we should. Far more than someone in Malawi. We have to recover that spirituality of simplicity, of frugality, living in a way that promotes harmony, not division, acknowledging that the earth is the Lord's. Think of a couple of images that we have that teach the same truth. Food, and food in its corollary vices of greed or gluttony, which vices, by the way, are not vices that you can't easily see. You can see greed and gluttony. Or the concomitant symptoms of food, of indifference or waste. Food comprises the most striking factor in ecological exploitation and economic inequity. The reason people go hungry today is not the number of people in the world. If there were fewer people, but the way we distribute food remained the same, the poor would still go hungry. The problem is the way we distribute food through the free market as private property, which people who are poor cannot afford. And there are two particular images in the Christian tradition that speak to our response to the ecological crisis, specifically on the matter of food. In the first, which is derived from the gospel parable, Jesus tells of a poor man, Lazarus, who lay at the gate of a rich man, as St. Luke says, longing to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. The rich man never once invited Lazarus to his table. In fact, what's worse, the rich man probably never even noticed Lazarus. I wonder sometimes whether we even notice what goes on around us. How many people do we invite to sit at our table? What issues, poverty or peace, or gun violence, or health care, or human rights, how many issues do we readily embrace? Or, to paraphrase a contemporary politician, perhaps the time has come to admit that the problem lies with those who gorge themselves. The problem is not the immigrant. The problem is not any particular religion. The problem is the insatiable greed of some who incessantly stuff themselves, and that problem, too, has a face, and it has a name. Then there's another well-known icon, an iconographic depiction about food and communion, sitting under the shade of the oak trees at Mamre, where Abraham welcomed an unexpected visit from 3 strangers. The story is recorded in Genesis 18, also in Hebrews 13. It describes the patriarch of Israel spontaneously sharing his friendship and food, extending such generous hospitality to foreigners, to complete strangers, that, at least in the Orthodox tradition, that scene is symbolical of the Holy Trinity and nothing less. In fact, the only authentic image of God as Trinity in the Orthodox Church is this encounter scene from rural Palestine. And traditional icons of Abraham's hospitality, as it's known, Sarah's usually left out, portray the guests on 3 sides of the table. They always leave an open space on the 4th side of the table, because the scene is an open invitation. Of course, as then Senator Barack Obama told the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Fight for Freedom in 2005, it's one thing that everyone has a seat at the table, but how's everyone going to pay for the meal? Or think of Pope Francis during his visit to the US in 2015, declining a meal with the US Congress and choosing to eat with the homeless in a neighboring park. There's a unique iconographic depiction of all this worldview, in an 18th century icon that's found in Crete in a monastery. It's literally a theological statement in color. The icon's title comes from the great blessing of the waters at the Feast of Epiphany on January 6th. It's repeated in the baptism of every Orthodox Christian. Great are you, Lord, and wondrous are your works. No words suffice to hymn your wonders. At the far left of the image, nature is portrayed as Mother Earth, that indigenous peoples throughout the world, whether the Indians of North America or the Aborigines of Australia, the Mother Earth that they have respected for centuries. The epic poet of ancient Greece writes, "She is the mother of all and the oldest of all. She nourishes all creatures that walk on the land, move in the deep, or fly in the air." So nature here extends her arms in a gesture of openness, of embrace. And then the icon also depicts urban life. There's the city of Samaria, the city of Nineveh in the background. It depicts agricultural life with the farmers tilling the slopes. And we can see people and rivers and vegetation, and a vast rainbow reflects the eternal covenant between the Creator and creation. The icon's rich in symbolism, but let me highlight 2 particular scenes. The first depicts Jonah, cast from the mouth of the large beast, as in the biblical story, a profound image of resurrection, of course, and renewal of all things. One of the early symbols of Christ, of course, whereby Christians recognized one another was, well, the fish. The Greek word ichthys being an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. So the fish is a statement of faith. Christ is integrally, inseparably identified with fish. And abuse of fishing or overfishing relates in a very personal way to Christ, in a very profound way to Christ, in a very painful way to Christ. The second scene depicts the slaying of Abel right in the middle there, under the rainbow curve. The slaying of Abel by Cain, a violent representation of the destructive impact of our current policies and practices, especially for future generations. Because until we perceive in the pollution of our planet the portrait of our brother and sister, we cannot resolve the injustice and inequality of our world. Until we discern in the pollution of our planet the face of our children, we cannot comprehend the irreversible consequences of our actions. So where do we go from here? My elder son and I once paid a visit to the optometrist, and Alex is not as meticulous as he should be with his eye care and many other things. So as he received his new prescription, I could hear his reaction of surprise inside the room. He said, "Wow, that's what I'm supposed to see?" When we look at our world, what do we see? Because the way we view our world reflects the way that we will relate to our world. We treat our planet in a God-forsaken manner because we see it in this way. And in his now classic article entitled "The Roots of Our Ecological Crisis," I get criticized for referring to him. People say he's not a church father. I know. In his article, Lynn White, medieval historian, I think he suspected this truth when he said, "The Greek saint contemplates. The Western saint acts. The Latins," he says, "felt that sin was moral evil, that salvation lay in right conduct, and the implications of Christianity for the conquest of nature will emerge more easily in the Western atmosphere." I think there's something profound in what he says here, because far too often we think that solving the ecological crisis is a matter of doing something different, of acting differently, maybe more effectively, more sustainably, whatever word people use. I recall an article a few years ago, which I paraphrase here for our purposes, originally published in the Wall Street Journal. The article said, "Yes, the world is sinking, and the band keeps playing. On the Titanic, first violinist, Big Oil's Koch brothers. For them, capitalism is the solution to everything. Everyone has a price. Everything has a price, especially politicians. Second chair, the world's moral authority, Patriarch Bartholomew and Pope Francis, warning we're destroying the planet, and playing a mean solo flute, Mother Nature, who doesn't care what climate change deniers think, but only what we do." Handing climate change over to capitalism or politicians is as good an idea as asking the iceberg to fix the Titanic. Whereas paradoxically, ecological correction might begin, if we use Lynn White's hint, with environmental inaction. It's a matter of contemplation. It's a matter, go back to the words we said about icons, it's a matter of seeing things differently. We're back to the notion of image and liturgy. First, we must stop what we're doing, and then we might gain a new insight into the world. And if we peer through that lens, well, foreign policy even looks different. The economy looks different. These now begin to allow us to abandon the urge for unbridled expansion and to focus on the sustainability we so desperately need. We can see the world in ways other than through the glass of the market. There actually can be a green way of looking at the world apart from that of Alan Greenspan. Some years ago, a presidential advisor and World Bank economist declared, Larry Summers is his name, America, he said, cannot and will not accept any speed limit on economic growth. Really? Have we become so addicted to fantasies about riches without risk, or profit without price? What is it about the model of life that we've tragically created that we override our own better judgment in service of our selfish nature? Do we honestly believe that our endless, mindless manipulation of the earth's resources comes at no cost, no consequence? Our economy, our technology, our society become toxic when divorced from our vocation to see the world as God would see the world. And if God saw the world, as we said at the beginning this evening, as very good on that sixth day of creation, then we too can see the world in its unfathomable beauty and interrelatedness. What we face is a radical choice, like Moses was offered in Deuteronomy. Today, I'm giving you a choice between good and evil, between life and death. Choose life. The question I leave you with is this: how do we live in such a way that reflects spiritual values, that communicates generosity and gratitude, not arrogance and greed? Because if we don't, then a significant patch of the Gulf Coast in our country will have been lost in vain. And the Fukushima nuclear disaster precipitated by the tsunami will have gone unnoticed if we don't. But if we do, we will hear the earth groan. We will notice the grass grow, and we will feel the seal's heartbeat. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Archdeacon John. At this point, we go into kind of a large group discussion, so I would ask those students who have volunteered to handle microphones to come down and identify yourself here. Good. Now, how this is going to work, because the lecture series is being live streamed and captured, if you want to ask a question, we can't really see you from up here. So we'll take turns from one aisle to the other, and they will come to you. Don't start talking until they hold the microphone in front of you, so that not only all of us in this lovely auditorium, but also those who are joining us through technology will be able to hear your question. And so with that, we'll turn it over to the helpers here.
Father, thank you. Thomas Leah from the Archdiocese of Chicago. I just think, oh no, never mind, it's still on. Question that I have is, I think a major temptation for us here, I think there's probably about 100, but I was wondering, how do we reject the temptation to say, okay, we're just one person and it doesn't really matter if we kind of go back to our habits, or we kind of just put this all to the side. How do, if you will.
So that's obviously, it's not a simple question. It's the basic question that most of us have to ask ourselves and find an answer to. A lot of you guys are studying for the priesthood. Others are doing various degrees in theology. I would say to you, how do you answer the same question when it comes to other issues in your life? when it comes to Lent, and you say, we're dealing with certain temptations, and this is what we need to fight against, why fight if you probably won't ever overcome that temptation? We have an answer to that, don't we? Because we need to keep struggling for the ideal, at least, that we want. That's the first thing. The second is that it's not easy. It's not meant to be easy. It's, at least for a Christian, where our central symbol is the cross, it's not fun. I mean, it's supposed to be hard. If you've found a comfortable way of sitting on the cross, maybe you're not on the cross. Maybe you say you're a Christian, but maybe you're not on the cross. You're probably somewhere else, and you need to question that. And third, we are each of us small. We are each of us vulnerable. And that's exactly what happens when we come to church. We don't, I often, used to ask students when I was teaching, why we go to church. And you'd get any number of responses that, we go there to pray, we go there to remember the dead, we go there to remember certain intentions, we go there to take communion, we go there to achieve a mystical life, a spiritual life, and whatever people go to Mass for every morning at 7:40. But I don't think it's any of those things. We actually go to church, and the early Christians went to church, and the early Christians went to church at the risk of their lives, and in fact, if they missed church a certain number of times, they were excommunicated. The early Christians went to church not to pray, you could pray at home. Not to take communion, they did take communion at home. But to take communion together, and that you can only do in Mass, in liturgy, in church. So we go to church to be with one another, recognizing that each of us, in himself and in herself, are very weak, but that together we make up the body of Christ. And as I was watching the Mass this morning, it's exactly the same in our liturgy in the Orthodox Church. The priest doesn't just place the body of Christ in the chalice. The priest breaks the body of Christ before putting it in the chalice. And it's not just a practical issue, so you've got to break it up because there's a fair few people we need to feed here. It's actually only the broken Christ and his blood that comes to meet our brokenness and fragility and vulnerability in communion. And we call that divine communion, Holy Communion. So it is small, but that small is much bigger than what can be measured. Does that make sense? I can't see you very well there.
Thank you, Archdeacon. I'm a seminarian for the Archdiocese of Chicago. So you mentioned a lot about some of the issues that capitalism poses to ecology and our ability to treat the environment with respect and form our worldview that is one of love towards creation. So talking about capitalism specifically, because I think a lot of the problems seem to have almost been built into the system. There's a lot of what I guess you could call structures of sin in terms of it's very difficult for us individually to be able to do whole-scale changes in order to respect the environment, at least, and I hope you understand what I mean when I say that. So in terms of the structures of capitalism, what needs to change overall in order for us to be able to combat the issues we have?
Again, good question here. You see, let's go back to the image of the cross. We have our structure in the Christian church, and we have the constitution that tells us about that structure in the church. But it's damn hard to pull off, isn't it, in the world? That's true. And as one of the elders on Mount Athos that I pictured earlier, Father Paisio, said, we say a prayer and we dive into the world that we know is fallen, we know is broken, but we do our best to resist, to fight. And there won't be a perfect solution in this world. There will be, we say, in heaven. But in this world, we're called to wrestle. We're called to battle. With the structures we have, they're not easily going to change, and they may be the best or better ones than others, best that we have at present. But don't get comfortable in that structure. Don't simply give up and say, it's just me, what am I going to pull off? Is Patrick here today, this evening? He preached this morning. So I was watching Patrick as he preached very beautifully. I enjoyed his sermon very much. As he was preaching, he was trembling. My advice to you would be, tremble more. Don't ever get comfortable. Certainly don't get comfortable in the priesthood, and we do. Don't get comfortable as Christians, and we certainly do. There's a struggle. The discomfort is probably a clearer image that you might be on the right path. But it is a constant struggle.
To push something. My name is Catherine, and I live in Mundelein, and I've been involved in my church with a Care for Our Common Home ministry. And on the Archdiocese of Chicago website, they, on their Care for Creation ministry, say, caring for our earth is a requirement of our faith, as through this practice we become stewards of creation. In doing so, we are compelled to live and act in ways that protect the well-being of the planet and its inhabitants, whether human or non-human, etc. And what I'm struggling right now is, it's my understanding that the ecumenical patriarch is actually doing quite a bit for the environment. And what I read, I'm very impressed with that. But I see our ministry going and attending marches and praying, etc. But last I heard, they're still investing in fossil fuels, and I don't see the action I would expect to see. And I would wonder if maybe the ecumenical patriarch is going to be collaborating more with our church in giving us ideas on how we can act more and walk our talk.
Okay, well, thank you again for that question. I agree, that's the difficult part, you know. How do you discern, how do you sort out what it is that you believe and what it is that you should also be doing? And it may be difficult. I remember speaking against, fossil fuels and oil and so forth when a young couple came up to me and said, that's our job, that's the only job we could find in this area. What do we do? And I don't have the answers to that. I really don't have the answers to that. But the fact that they were asking the question was huge for me, huge. So I think I'll be talking tomorrow actually about the relationship between the Patriarch and the Pope. I think we're very blessed in our time to have two leaders such as these two, who are on the same wavelength, who do get it, who do understand the importance of God's creation, who understand the importance of the least of our brothers and sisters who've worked together a couple of times. They've published declarations I'll talk about tomorrow, separately, but also together, where they've mentioned poverty and fossil fuels and natural protection of nature and so forth. And they've even issued one encyclical together, I think it was the year before last, on the 1st of September. They meet regularly, they understand, I think, one another. They've visited the island of Lesbos in Greece to meet with the refugees, and you'll remember the Pope took a whole number of refugees home to Rome with him. So I think we can hope for more collaboration, and it's precisely the reason why I picked up the phone to speak to Father Thomas. So, yes.
Good evening, Marko Pranic from the Diocese of Albany, New York. As a liturgiologist and a person studying it, I very much liked your definition of a liturgy as coming together, being with everybody else, but also liturgy, and especially the Eucharist, as a moment where things of heaven are routed to things of the earth when the two meet in that precious moment. So in earth, trying to be like the heaven is, that perfection as it was in the beginning, how God created it. It might be a bit of a broad question, but how do we, who are participating in that mystery, how do we take from that and apply it in a practical ways in caring for the environment, drawing from the liturgy itself? Thank you.
So yeah, I think I do. I believe firmly that the Eucharist gives us the picture of what we're aiming for in terms of, as I said earlier, the brokenness of Christ coming out to encounter the brokenness of us, sitting next to one another as broken human beings, bringing before Christ the bread that's broken, crumbled, the wine that we've mashed, the oil that we've crushed. There's another side to the Eucharist that I think, I hope I'm not being too provocative here, but that I think certainly students of theology and students of the priesthood would do good to remember from time to time. The way I said about the moment of creation, that it wasn't just Adam, it was his special, birthday, but it was a much broader creation. So to the Eucharist. Yes, it is the heavenly, almost overcoming or transforming the earthly. But we do tend to forget that the Eucharist is also the earthly as it is intended to be. So it is a bit provocative, but I would say that the bread and the wine that we believe becomes the body and the blood of Christ also is bread and wine. But what bread and wine is supposed to be is not just a loaf of bread and a bottle of Australian wine. It is what they are intended by God to be. So don't overlook that earthly side, because that means that when you're meeting with someone, that person is Christ. That's what we read in Scripture. That person is the body of Christ in his or her brokenness and ugliness and homelessness and poverty and dirtiness. We like to have things more attractive in the spiritual world, like to talk about mystical things, but the mystical is the most ordinary very often, and we should not forget that. It means that when you're shopping, you should be looking for where a particular product was made. and how it's made and where it comes from and under what conditions. Are you going to save that entire region? Probably not. But it's what you're called to do, to look deeply for that heavenly in the very earthly. So don't separate as much between heaven and earth, and you'll be able to see more heaven in earth. You know, and as I said earlier, and St. Simeon the New Theologian says quite clearly, if you don't see Christ in this world, you're not going to see him in the next. And you know, talk about the earthly, it's the earthly that Christians have always had a problem with, which is really sad for me. It's actually scandalous because Christians are the religion of creation, of material, of the body, of the world. Our God assumed flesh, walked among us, took on everything, tempted by everything except sin. So if you look at, in your studies, look at all of the heresies through the centuries, none of them have a problem with God being God. If God's in heaven, who cares? You can say whatever you like about him, and yeah, he's great, and it's Trinity, and it's this and that. Where the problem is on the human side of Christ. Nobody has a problem with God saving us, but when you're talking about a little baby, as Nestorius would, who's really snotty and poopy, born in Bethlehem, and that baby saved us, you want to change the diapers, not talk theology. But that's what our faith is, that human was saved, was transformed, was divinized, was filled with God. And everything in our world should be looked at like that. Everything in our world can be treated like that. But that's the harder part. As I say, it's easier to divide, to distinguish, and say, let's do Mass, and then we can pretty much do anything we want. We're doing our best. Doesn't work that way.
I'm Matthew Jombrowski from the Diocese of Saginaw, Michigan. So thinking about what you just said with especially caring for our brothers and sisters, each person's human dignity. So I'm thinking about, again, we see a lot in first world countries where we do waste a lot, and we do harm the earth through our greed for material goods. I think a lot about third world countries, and the easiest route for them out of poverty may be the consumption of fossil fuels to lift them out of that poverty that they have so desperately. So how are we to respond to that, where to lift people out of poverty as an easy way to get out, we use these fossil fuels, not helpful for the environment. On the same hand, we do want to lift people out of poverty. How do we reconcile that difficulty there, if you can respond to that?
So I'm giving answers here, but none of them are answers, okay, because I ask the same questions you ask. But I'm trying to glean some sort of a response because that's what Father Thomas asked me to come and do here. On the basis, or using as a parameter, the sort of issues I talked about this evening. First of all, again, I wouldn't draw a distinction between ours and a third world country. You could drive a few minutes away from here and see everything you've just described. Okay, that's in a country that knows about fossil fuels and knows better. That's in a country that knows it wastes and still does. So don't go too far away. But in terms of, you know, the more global sort of picture here, again, politically, I don't know what the answer is, but I do believe that we have to sort of bend over more to assist these countries if we're going to help them understand that there's a price to pay if they head in that direction. That means that we are going to have to pay the price for those other countries to find a way that's different, to find a solution that is different to the one that we know is almost suicidal. And we don't want to do that, because that's a heavy price. Part of the price, though. We don't want to admit our mistake, and we don't want others to cause problems, not so much for them or our planet. Probably we're still thinking selfish ways. We don't want their lifestyles, abusing nature, exhausting the earth's, depleting the earth's resources. We don't want that to affect our life. That's a problem. It means we really haven't moved away from the same direction we've been heading. We need to think completely out of the box. A new lens, as I said earlier, which will mean finding different solutions or looking for different answers. Ones that might be uncomfortable, ones that might shatter, challenge our normal way of understanding things. Something like that.
My name is Deacon Michael Block. I'm from Lafayette, Indiana. Thank you very much, Archdeacon, for your beautiful presentation, the vision of how we could live in harmony with creation. I'm wondering if you could speak a little more about how we can cultivate that spiritual disposition through which we recognize creation as an icon of the Creator, maybe even some practical, tangential actions that we could take even tomorrow, for example. Thank you.
So I do think, again, most of my studies took me into the desert of Egypt and Sinai and Palestine and the ascetic tradition, the monastic tradition of the early desert fathers and mothers. And I saw and see in their lives, in their lifestyles, as in their writings and advice, a sense of realism, a sense of recognition that we don't have to look for, to go back to one of the earlier questions, the salvation of everything. A sense of what we can do is do our best and recognize that we fall short and that we will never be perfect. Only God is perfect. In fact, I would say that's a good definition of sin, forgetting that we're imperfect. For thinking, imagining that we are God. And people reach out for all these solutions, better solutions. They've got the solution, a political solution, an economic solution, a technical solution, as if that's going to be the healing of everything. A recognition that we're going to blow it, but we want better, and we want just a little bit better than what we have now, and we want for our children a little better than what we found. And the recognition that all of our actions, the most intimate and the most private, to the most public, are actions that affect other people. We know that from science, that what happens in one place affects something the other side of the world, the slightest flutter of a butterfly. And it's all about remembering that sense of imperfection is our greatest strength, our greatest awareness, our greatest inspiration, our greatest connection with everyone else. When I just saw Michelle here this evening, where is she? Whom I knew from Holy Cross. Hi. And it brought back memories from my time at the seminary in Boston. And there's a story I told in a retreat once, and I don't think I've thought of this in 25 years, but when I was at the seminary, I decided I wanted to teach my students where I was teaching a class on spirituality and silence, actually, on doing nothing and what that means and how profound that is. And I remember deciding that I would take this class to a nearby monastery at Spencer, and I was going to have them basically sit in silence for a whole day. They were to talk, not a word. They were to read nothing. They weren't to move too much, just to sit in silence, and not in a chapel, just anywhere on the grounds of the monastery. And I remember my younger son, Julian, who uses a wheelchair. And he said to me, he had to be 6 or 7 at the time, we had just arrived from Australia. And he said, can I go with you? And I said, well, it's not exactly going to be a fun day. There were a couple of students that he knew. There was this, I don't know if Michelle remembers him, Dimitri Moraitis, who was a wrestler, a really big guy, and used to carry Julian on his neck, around his shoulder. And so Julian said, I want to come, Dimitri's going. And I said, well, it's not going to be a fun day. They're going to be doing nothing all day. And of course, he knew which plug to use. He said, well, if Alex had asked you, you would have said yes. So anyway, he came with us. And I remember booking the bus, the van of the school that fit about 20 or so people in it, to take us all there. And that was a lesson in itself. You don't trust the van of a school. So off we went towards Spencer, which is probably an hour and a half away. It wasn't very far at all, but just half an hour in, as we got to Route 128 and this massive sort of circular route in Boston that's just traffic and nothing else, the bus broke down. And I remember one of the students saying to me, Father, can you gather us and talk to us about spirituality? And I said, Dimitri, we should call AAA. So we did, but we were told this wasn't an emergency. We weren't in trouble or in any way. We were just sitting at the side of a highway with nothing near us, and that it would take at least a couple of hours. Must have been a holiday, I think, a Monday holiday. And so I did. I gathered everyone around and thought, let's do something here that might impress these students. And I said to everyone, okay, we failed in what we're going to do. We were supposed to head to Spencer and have this really spiritual experience, and we broke down on the highway. We're not even getting to the place we wanted to get, and we're not going to get much prayer done on the side of a highway. So what do you feel about what just happened? And each of the students, we went around a circle, and they all described how they felt. And I got to Julian, who was sitting on my left, and I thought I'd ask him. As I say, he was 6 or 7 at the time. And he said to me, I feel blessed. And I said, what do you mean by blessed? He said, I can't understand why you would feel that, I took you out for a drive with these students and the bus broke down and you feel lucky. He said, well, I didn't say lucky. I said, blessed. And I said, why? He said, Dad, because you remember how we sometimes go on drives and you take us to places far away and along the way, I see people whose car has broken down. And I've always wondered what those people feel. And now I know. We're not talking a 7-year-old mystic. No, we're not talking a 7-year-old Einstein. But we're talking a 7-year-old who knew what it was to be broken, whose legs didn't work, who knew what it meant not to be able to do exactly as others. And he felt a connection from that experience. The slightest, most insignificant experience can be a connection with other people and with all of creation.
Let's thank Archdeacon John. Now, a couple of times tonight in his talk, Archdeacon John has reminded me that I kind of ambushed him to come here. But I was thinking on the side there, even though we both were born in countries of Anglo origin, we both have Mediterranean roots. And so I've also realized that I now owe him a favor. So we'll see how that all plays out.
That was the goal.
We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 o'clock here in the Mundelein Auditorium, and we'll continue with the program with Archdeacon John's second lecture, and then the responses by Father Schoenstein and Father Kunkel, and then another general discussion first with the presenters on a panel, and then with all of you as we've done tonight. So have a good evening, God bless you, and we will see you tomorrow.